We are about educating the public on science. We are about inspiring kids to take up science as a profession. And we are about preserving our legacy here at Mound Lab. So anyway, tonight we have a speaker who has worked on the Dayton Project, the Dayton Project being part of the Manhattan Project, and it produced the polonium which was necessary to set off the first nuclear weapons. So without the polonium from Dayton, as it turns out, we would have no Trinity or Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and so forth. So anyway, tonight, George, who came to Dayton in 1946 to work on this Dayton project, is going to tell us about the problems, the history, and maybe some other things. So I'll be quiet. Please welcome George Mahfouz.
Thank you. Upside down. Am I on now? Yeah. No. You don't have me in the back? No. In the back, I go on like this.
There you go.
There's a microphone.
I got a microphone somewhere. Okay. As our chairman mentioned, we're going to talk about the Dayton Project plus a few other things today. I've only got an hour to talk about this thing, but I got about that many feet of paperwork on the Manhattan Project at home, and no, we're not going to be here till 4 in the morning to hear it. I don't think I can last that long. But anyway, these are only a small portion of the influential people on the start of the Manhattan Project. Not only on the start, but on work that was done prior to the beginning of the Manhattan Project. On the upper left-hand side is Vannevar Bush, who was one of the foremost scientists back prior to World War II, actually. And he was highly respected by everybody, up to and including the president. He had the president's ear, and the president listened to him practically every time he talked. And he chaired a committee, National Defense Research Council, which was made up of about 9 different groups. And the assistant of the group, incidentally, on that one was James Bryant Conant, who was the former president of Harvard University, and about as influential as Vannevar Bush was when it came to the Manhattan Project and other technical aspects of the World War II, besides the atomic bomb, that is. Charlie Thomas was the vice president of Monsanto at the time, and he was the director of Central Research. His partner was Ted Hockwalt, and digressing slightly, at one point in time when Central Research was organized, that was about 1926, Boss Kettering was in charge of a research project for which Charlie Thomas and Ted Hockwalt worked, and they worked on tetraethyl lead, which is something you use in your gasoline today. And he was a little upset because he wasn't getting the kind of credit that he thought he ought to be getting for the work that he and Hockwalt were doing. So Boss Kett suggested that maybe he ought to be doing something else. So what he did was he and Hockwalt started up the Nicholas Road Research Plant in 1926. They did 60% of the work they were doing was for Monsanto, and so eventually in 1936 Monsanto bought them out, and it became a division of the Monsanto Corporation at that time. When I came to Dayton in '46, the Monsanto company catalog of all the chemicals and things that they produced was a book about 5 by 7, and it was about 3/4 of an inch thick. So they had a lot of products, they had a lot of research people, they were doing a lot of advanced work, very highly respected. 2 products that you might be acquainted with. The first one that I can think of is the detergent all, which was developed and invented here in Dayton at Nicholas Road. And the second item is one that some of you non-beer drinkers might be interested in knowing. When Prohibition was over, you're all too young to remember that, or too old, I'm not sure which way it goes, but anyway, they had, there was a shortage of whiskey. Nobody reacts to that, I don't understand it. But anyway, so it's the distillers organization rather, decided that they ought to have something they can do to speed up the aging of whiskey, and so Nicholas Slab got the contract to develop a process whereby they could age whiskey real fast, and they did. Not being a whiskey drinker at that time, I was a little bit too young. I can't tell you how good or bad it was, but anyway, those are two things that they invented. Of course, some of you were also, other products can remember things like nylon and acrylan and that type of thing, was made by the Chemstrand division down in Pensacola, Florida. Okay, let's move on. Now, of course, on the Manhattan Project, the lower left photograph is General Groves, who was the military commander. In fact, he was in charge of everything on that. And from what I've read about him, I don't know who they could have gotten that could have done a better job. He did an unbelievable job under horrible circumstances. He marshaled a lot of people, and again, was able to get everything organized. The Manhattan Project developed. Oak Ridge was bought out, staffed. Los Alamos, of course, you all heard about. Hanford, Washington. And of course, we don't want to forget the Dayton Project. And on the lower right is J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of Los Alamos. And at that time, when we first started, the Dayton organization did not report to Los Alamos at all. Well, we never did. We actually reported originally to the Chicago Operations Office. And there were a number of these operations offices. Oak Ridge was one, Chicago was another one, Albuquerque was another one. There's one up in New York, I can't remember the name of it at the moment, but anyway, those are five people excuse me, involved, but they're not the only people involved in the Manhattan Project or in the nuclear program. The nuclear program actually is there anybody here by the name of Murphy?
You have to point it here if you want it to change.
What are we doing, Dick?
You have to point it right here. Point, there you go.
Now you tell me.
See, that works.
Okay. I mentioned the Dayton Project, and I mentioned Central Research. That is an overhead shot of the Central Research operation, which was for all of, by the way, all of Monsanto. Somewhere in the 50s, Monsanto decided to consolidate all our research in St. Louis, and eventually this was sold to somebody else, and it's no longer in existence. It was, as I said, on Nicholas Road. For those of you who play golf, if you went to the golf course, Madden Golf Course, you always pass this, and it was a big installation, by the way. I forget how many acres they had, but at one time, especially in the spring, they would plow up, I forget how many acres, and then the employees, we all could go there, and we had a garden 50 by 50 plots, and that was a pretty nice fringe benefit, I think. Okay, research and development prior to the Manhattan Project. Now, nuclear energy is, or the concept of nuclear energy is not a modern item. Actually, back about 450, a Greek philosopher named Demosthenes came up with the idea that all matter had to be made up of some very small parts. So if you want to know how far back it goes back a long time. Now, there were other philosophers that came up subsequently to that, all about the same time, by the way, and they all seem to be Greek. Your knowledge of the Greek situation today is nothing more than their economy and some of the foods that they have. But anyway, that was the beginning. What happened?
You're going. Go to the next one.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a minute. We're a little bit ahead of ourselves. Now, worldwide, as we move forward, there were probably somewhere between 15 and 20 physicists in Europe who were working on an atomic theory. They knew that a bomb could be built eventually, and they spent a lot of time communicating. By the way, they always communicated with each other. They weren't jealous of each other. They wrote letters about the results of their lab work, and we're looking at about, as I said, 15 to 20 of them. But what was unknown, and this started about 1930, is the Japanese at one of their universities set up a research organization, and they were developing, well, they had a lab set up, they had linear accelerators, and they were setting up to make up the separation of uranium-235 and 239 because they knew they could build a bomb. Now, this is back in 1930-31. We hadn't even thought about that here. Well, in time, most of the people that were involved in the development in Europe came to the United States. The majority of them were Jewish, and of course they were not exactly welcomed by Hitler. Thank God for that. And so they all came to the United States, and most all of them went to work for what eventually became the Manhattan Project. They were very dedicated people. Enrico Fermi is probably one of the names you remember. No, he was not Jewish, but his wife was Jewish, and of course that caused a problem for Hitler, and it caused a problem for Mussolini. So he emigrated and came to this country also. So in 1943, early that year, Charlie Thomas, getting back to him, Witness was in charge of one of the government agency research organizations, and he went to witness an underwater explosive demonstration. At that meeting, he met James Bryant Conant, and they got to be very friendly with each other, and of course developed a close relationship. When the testing was done, Charlie came back to Dayton, and about 3 or 4 weeks later, he receives a call from General Groves and says he'd like to see him. Obviously, during wartime, when a general calls you up and wants to see you, you listen to him, right? So he gets there, and there's James Bryant Conant, and I explained to Charlie at this point in time the idea of an atomic weapon in Los Alamos and what was going on. And of course, he obviously agreed, yes, he would do whatever he could do. So after they had a meeting of about 3 or 4 days to explain about the problems and what needed to be done, they offered him the job of, at that time, of being co-director of Los Alamos along with Oppenheimer. He couldn't accept that because he was still busy being the head of the research of Monsanto's corporate research group. And so they said, well, how about you taking over and heading up the polonium research? Of course, they'd already explained to him that we needed polonium as a trigger so that we could detonate the uranium. So he agreed to that, and he obviously had to get corporate approval for all of that. So anyway, subsequent to that meeting in Washington, they all went to Los Alamos, met with Oppenheimer, reviewed the whole thing, and not too long after that, Dr. Fernandez spent a week at the University of California. Now, a lot of work had been done at universities here in the United States, Columbia, Virginia Tech, of all places, which I'd never heard about before that. And so a lot of work was being, a great deal of work was being done on uranium, polonium, initiators, and that type of thing. And so they decided they were going to have to set up a research program to be able to extract and produce polonium. Polonium was a rare element. It had been discovered by Madame Curie about 1898. Her husband also was a physicist or a chemist, and together they developed that. They also developed and invented, as it were, the element radium. And as a result of her working with all that radioactivity, eventually she developed cancer, and that's what did her in. That also did her daughter in, also, who was also a chemist later. But anyway, now the trouble with the polonium was that nobody knew anything about it. The amount of knowledge was essentially zero. Most of the knowledge was at the University of California. So after the meeting in Los Alamos, and Monsanto agreed to take on the contract to produce polonium. Dayton was the site that was selected for that, and it was started out actually at Central Research, which was the beginning. There was one lab that was set aside for polonium research, but of course the idea of an atomic weapon, secrecy was a word that was just, you can't believe what they meant by secrecy. Just to give you an idea of that, anybody that worked at Los Alamos who was born during this period or subsequent to the meeting of our getting involved with polonium, children were designated as being born at a post office box in Santa Fe. That's how sticky it got. But anyway, so they set up the one lab at Nicholas Road with about 3 or 4 scientists, and they figured out that it was going to take about maybe 9 people initially. As I said earlier, Fernandez went for about a week or 10 days to the University of California to learn all they could learn about polonium, and so then he comes back. Now they have a problem because they are not assigned a priority rating. They didn't want anybody, they meaning the government, General Groves did not want anybody to know anything about what we were doing. It was just important war work that was needed. So when Monsanto needed material or supplies or what have you initially at the Dayton lab, that was the relationship that they had with all the local suppliers was such that when they ordered it, they said that's for the war effort, and the suppliers, thank God, gave them whatever they needed. So after a few weeks, they realized that the staffing of polonium work at Nicholas Road was not practical. One space, it was in conflict with all the work that was needed to be done for corporate Monsanto for their research work. Now that's still going on, not necessarily war related. So they began looking around for a place to set up a lab.
I got it.
What'd I do?
I got it.
Oh yeah, okay. That's what I was trying to get. So they needed a place to set up a laboratory to start with a research and development organization for the learning something about polonium. We don't have any. It's so rare that it just wasn't available. So anyway, they decided that they needed a larger place. They looked around. Now the reason they didn't decide to buy real estate and build a plant, they didn't have time. So the time crunch was unbelievable at this time, because one of the big reasons, of course, was that they knew that Germany was working on an atomic weapon, but we didn't know, the United States, did not know how far advanced that Germany, were on the development of an atomic weapon, because they knew that if they succeeded in developing that weapon, they would win the war. So when you talk about priority, that was the #1 priority as far as General Groves was concerned. And so they found this building. This is the Bone Break Seminary at one time back in the latter part of the 1800s. It had been turned over to the city of Dayton eventually as to the Board of Education. It became a book repository. They abandoned it, and so they found this place, and believe it or not, there was nothing inside. Staircases from, for example, from the first to the second floor was non-existent. No plumbing, no electrical work, no furnace, no lights, nothing. And it looked, the inside looked even worse than the outside did. However, that didn't discourage them. Charlie Thomas was a hard guy to discourage, by the way, fortunately. So this was Unit 3. Oh, I didn't tell you, originally Central Research was Unit 1. This became Unit 3. And they moved in to the first floor with a small research group and began working while contractors were working on the second and the third floor. Now, the problem that they had was that they had decided not to have air conditioning because they couldn't wait to get the air conditioning in there. So they did everything else, set up the research group, the laboratories rather. Well, that caused them a problem because the instruments that were needed to count some level of radioactivity, which they've been able to get to hold some pretty dilute stuff from someplace, the instruments failed to work because it was too hot for them. They needed air conditioning. So then they had to stop and install an air conditioning system. At the same time, as I said earlier, they were working on, they meaning the contractors, were working on the second and the third floor. And eventually they got those in there. Now everything that was, oh, that's located, by the way, at Euclid and West First Street on that street corner. This building, not looking like this, of course, is still there. It was turned back to the Board of Education. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
I'll do it, okay.
You got it?
You're good.
Have it. Now, this is the layout, and unfortunately, this is the best shot that we have of what was inside of Unit 3. Now, everything you needed was in this main building, the administrative offices, labs, and this is only the first floor. The other two floors, we don't have any, we don't have anything on that. So that was staffed remarkably fast. Dr. Lum, who was a Central Research group leader at the time, and of course he was moved up into the work that was necessary to produce polonium, was awarded the distinct honor of going around and trying to hire people which were non-existent except out of the universities. And of course, he must have been a great salesman because he convinced a lot of people to come to work for Monsanto without knowing what they were going to do and how the organization was going to work and what the product was. It just, come on, this is for the war effort, and that was about it. But he convinced them. And they did get the staff, all three floors, by the way.
I'll do it.
Oh, yeah. Now, we had a lot of, I mentioned earlier, the dedication of the employees, especially not only in the Dayton area, but the rest of the country working on the Manhattan Project. Well, as you can imagine, during the war, there's always such a thing called a spy. And believe it or not, we had one here in Dayton. And that's a picture of, I hate to tell you, but his first name was George. Last name was Kovar, and he was actually American born. He was born in Iowa, went to school in Iowa, graduated there, went to City College in New York, studied electrical engineering, was drafted into the Army, and became a member of what they call the SED, which is the Special Engineering Detachment. Now what happened during the war, everybody was getting drafted. We needed technical people, but they weren't available. So the government began looking at people within the Army who were degreed engineers or scientists of one type or another. And they were assigned to a group called the SED, the Special Engineering Detachment. As far as the Dayton area was concerned, there were probably somewhere around 30 to 35 people assigned from the SED to work in Dayton when they began staffing it more fully. I'm a little ahead of myself. Now at the same time, and I'll digress momentarily here, because before coming to Dayton, I worked for a company in Illinois called Rudolph Hershey. They were part of the Manhattan Project. If you go to Decatur, Illinois, and you look for the plant, it's non-existent. Never even gets mentioned. I looked for it in the literature, and I can't even find it. Yeah, I did work there for 2 years. We were making the barrier for the K-25 process down in Oak Ridge. By the way, every place when I mention Oak Ridge reminds me, it was code name for all of the various sites: Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, the General Electric plant down in Florida, Brookhaven, University of Chicago. Now you won't be surprised when I tell you that the code name for Oak Ridge in Tennessee was called Dog Patch. I always thought that was funny. I don't know why. But anyway, back to Kowal. So he wound up somehow or other over in Asia on a trip or something. He's coming back to the United States. Now he's an American-born guy, by the way, American-educated. Did not have his degree yet. And so when they landed in San Francisco, on the way back from Eastern Asia, he gets very friendly with the captain and members of his family and what have you. So when they get to San Francisco, the captain gets off the ship. He's right along with the captain, being real friendly and all that. The immigration people, of course, knew the captain, and they figured this guy was part of his crew, and so they just waved him on in. But he's already been trained, incidentally. He'd gone back to Russia and been trained by the KGB, or whatever their military group was called back in those days, to be a spy. So he gets drafted, and he then is assigned to work down at Oak Ridge. He's a very smart guy, by the way. And so he's made a group leader down there, and of all places, in all departments, the health physics group, which allows him, as a group leader, he has a car, and he can drive all over Oak Ridge so he can see everything that's going on. Well, everything that he learned, you know where all that wound up? It wound up in Moscow. And he was there for over a year, I guess, or better. And moving forward back to Dayton again, hope I'm not confusing you. We need health physics people here because we're starting up Unit 4 this time, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so he gets transferred back to Dayton as a health physicist, and he can go any place, Unit 3, Unit 4, and he knew exactly what was going on because he had access to all the information that he needed, plus all the information he didn't even need. However, all that information wound up in Moscow. Eventually, we'll move forward a little bit. When the war was over, he was discharged, went back to City College in New York, I believe it was, finished up his electrical engineering degree, and then went to work for another company, and he became a representative of theirs in their international group, apparently. I was shipped back to France, and then he disappeared. We had no way of knowing where he went. The FBI eventually caught up with all of this, but it was too late. He was gone. All right. Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
I got it.
Thank you. Oh, this is a group picture of the people at Unit 3 and Unit 4. The highlighted area there. I've got one of these animals here that lets it. That guy right there. We, meaning the people on the staff here at the museum, aren't really sure, but we think that's him in this group picture. And that's only a part of a picture of all the people at Unit 3 and Unit 4 at the time. Now, in case you're wondering, and I really don't think you've already wondered about it, but Central Research was called Unit 1, Unit 3 was bookbinder, was the book repository, Unit 4 was Runnymede, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And eventually we built Unit 5, which is Mound, which you know about. And yes, we do know how to count. We haven't talked about Unit 2. Well, Unit 2 was not a part of the Manhattan Project. It was a separate operation and contract that Monsanto had with the Air Force to develop jet-assisted units to help bombers get off the ground. For some reason or other, the military always overloaded the bombers, and they needed a little extra push. The engines couldn't get it off the ground, but these jet-assisted units, which we made here off of Route 741, I'm not quite sure where that was. Somewhere in the vicinity.
Across from the Habitat.
Across from?
Across from the Habitat condominiums, just south of the mall.
Just south
north of the mall.
North of the mall. Okay.
There's a church there.
Anyway, we're really not sure, but we think that's him.
Were you in that picture, George?
No, that was taken before I came here. In fact, he was gone. He had been discharged. He had been discharged from the Army about the time I came. I came in 45. That's a long time ago, you know that. Anyway, so back at Unit 3 and the R&D work going on there. Some ore was processed at Unit 3 besides the research operation. We meaning the Dayton people obtained ore from Cape Hope, I believe it is, up in Canada, which is a radium operation up there. And we processed some, I forget how many thousand pounds at Unit 3. How many? 7,000 pounds. They only processed part of it over there, then eventually they needed more room, and they looked around. And again, we needed a lot of space, not available, couldn't get it. So Charlie Thomas, who was married to one of the Talbot daughters, Mrs. Talbot resided in Oakwood on Runnymede. If you're not sure where that is, for those of you who know where 5 Point is, as you go down Far Hills, north of Far Hills, okay, well, if you turn left there, if you're northbound, you turn left, you go up Runnymede Road, probably about 100 yards is what used to be the Runnymede Playhouse, Runnymede Road, on Runnymede, off Runnymede Road. Well, this is the Playhouse. Now, the term Playhouse is somewhat misleading because when the day I was hired and they were talking about where they were going to have me assigned to work, I was still at Unit, everything was done at Unit 3, by the way. They kept on talking about the Playhouse, and I couldn't visualize what kind of an installation would I be working at that was a Playhouse. Well, they had me driven over to Unit 4, and that's the Playhouse that I saw. Now that,
I got it.
well, let's back up. There we are.
Whoops.
That's all right. We're all right. We're okay. Now that's the main building. The long dimension is about 176 feet, and what would be like the north-south dimension would be about pretty close to 80 feet. And that was the main building, and that had in it enough space and room for a tennis court, and of course all that complex that you see up there was part of the original main building, and all of that was under contract for the government to do further work. What the people in Oakwood were told was that it was going to become a photo lab, and that's as far as they went. Of course, there was a lawsuit on that. The government, of course, during war has unbelievable authority, and so they had no way of stopping the work that was going to go there. So all of a sudden, the people in Oakwood found out we had a site. We had fencing, metal fencing, barbed wire top across the top, lighting. That's the lower area. That's a pretty big place, by the way, actually. That's the back side of the Playhouse. And yeah. So the locker room, some of these other smaller buildings were, of course, they became locker room and coal labs and that type of thing. The main process area of the main building was partitioned, and of course, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning equipment was set up in there, and the process labs were set up, and enough work had been done at Unit 3. They were able to develop the process. Now, the process initially consisted of dissolving bismuth slugs, which were about 4 inches long and 1.5 inches in diameter. They were aluminum jacketed, and they were processed in, next slide. You get the monolite room there?
Oh, okay.
There we are. Within the main building area, of course, labs were set up, partitioned and all that. And there was one room where there were 2 reactors. These are glass line reactors, but only one was used at a time. The reason we have 2 is you couldn't take a chance on something happening at the other one, because they were glass line. And of course, before you charged it with bismuth slugs, let me get my little pointer here. I didn't do it.
No, I took her.
Right, these manholes. All right, now, from a process standpoint, what happened is those would be, one of them would be used at a time. The lid would be taken off, and then about a foot of dry ice would be placed on the bottom of the reactor. And then we loaded them, highly technical approach. They got a hold of every able-bodied man, and you lined up next to the shielded keg. It was an egg crate, actually. It was what it looked like, and all these slugs were in there. And you'd reach down there. I'll take that back. The health physics guy would pick up with a set of tongs a bismuth slug. By the way, there's one back here in the room. Don't take it home, it's contaminated. Don't believe it. And they'd hand you this bismuth slug, and you're on a platform, which you don't see here. And then you would take a bismuth slug by hand. They'd line up all the men. Women weren't allowed to do this. You girls ought to be happy about that. But anyway, and then we would place it at the bottom of the reactor, because you could reach in. That wasn't that far down from the manhole to the bottom where the bed of dry ice was. And you did about 5 or 6 slugs that way, and then you were done for the day. Then you went up to the lounge, which we had a very nice lounge, by the way, up there. And what did we do in the meantime? Well, we either read reports or played bridge. I mean, because there was nothing else to do. They didn't let you go home. Of course, it didn't make any difference. Until we charged the reactor, then it was buttoned up, heat was applied. Those reactors had what they call a jacket on them, and they would apply heat. They would evaporate all the dry ice, and then we would add hydrochloric acid to get rid of the aluminum jackets on that. And then we would neutralize the hydrochloric acid after that with formic acid. And of course, all this liquid would be pumped out as it was used up, and it would be loaded into a 30-gallon steel drum that was packed with, we used to call it kitty litter, I don't know what it was. And that was buttoned up, and that was shipped to Oak Ridge, because it was pretty contaminated. And then, of course, the bismuth was dissolved with a combination of hydrochloric and nitric acid, aqua regia, and that would dissolve the bismuth slugs. And then formic acid would be added at this point again, and it would decompose the nitric acid. And bismuth powder, very fine, 325 mesh, would be dropped into the reactor, and then it would be agitated. And after about 5 days, they figure enough polonium had deposited on the bismuth particles, and of course it was always checked because you had to sample the liquid, take a sample of the liquid, up to the counting room to verify that enough polonium had been removed. If it didn't do it, then just stayed at it. It might take you another day or two. That went on for quite a while. That was the normal process. Now the reason it's called the Marlite room, actually, that was not the official name. In fact, I don't even know what the official name was now that I think about it. But anyway, the reason it's called the Marlite room is the oil that you see up there is, if you all know what masonite is, well, Marlite is masonite that's been coated with a very high gloss, hard finish, acid resistant paint. Or some coating, I guess is a better word. And so that was the first operation. Now, the first day that I reported to work over at Unit 4, Ed McCarthy, who was my group leader and eventually became plant manager at Mound here, we were going through that, and he was explaining the process. And I said, well, why do we do it like that? He said, how else would you do it? I said, why don't we just make a bed of bismuth and pass the liquid through it? And you'll be done in an hour at most. And he said, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. So he said, let me talk to Joe. Joe meaning Dr. Burbage, who was the group leader or plant manager of what went on there. Eventually became director of Mound. And he said, this is conversation between him and Ed McCarthy. Gee, this other gentleman, other engineer that we just hired, a guy named Malcolm McEwen, I took him on a tour of what is going on here in Unit 4. Incidentally, when you got there, they took you on a tour of the thing and you met everybody. I mean everybody, all 85 people. And so it was a pretty friendly place, really. So he said, would you believe that McEwen just came up with the same idea? And they said, yeah, it's a pretty good idea. What do you think? And Joe said, well, we're just going to have a two-man research group that are going to prove the theory. And that's how we got started building the process subsequent to this process, where we were passing the acidic solution of polonium through bismuth beds and getting it all done in just a matter of an hour or so. And I really don't know who that is down on the bottom, because everybody knew everybody else. With 85 people, you get pretty friendly pretty fast. Okay, which is all right. Now, after the processing in the Fogler kettles, you have to do something with it. The idea is to reduce all the solution to where you have the polonium on a small bed of bismuth crystals. Well, the next step was to put it in these glove boxes, which incidentally were referred to as elephants. And if you see the gauntlets that are hanging now, the vinyl gauntlets, whoever saw the first time they had the thing set up, so that, gee, that looks like a bunch of elephants, and so it became an elephant line. That's how the name got there. The gauntlets were made by the sewing group over at Unit 3. They heat sealed the vinyl, made the gauntlets, and those are rubber gloves on the end, and what's holding everything together are embroidery hoops. Anything in the storm that you need. And that I believe is the second line. Prior to this time, all the processing was done in open fume hoods, which is not a good way to do it, because if you walk in front of an open fume hood, some of that, whatever's in the fume hood, wafts itself way out into the atmosphere, and that's not healthy. Now, is Warren she in here tonight?
He couldn't come, he had another appointment.
Oh,
Call
sorry.
me up and apologize, and tell George I can't be there.
I had a question for him, but I don't remember what it was now, so we can do that up. But anyway, talking about Warren was a health physicist, and a very fine one, by the way. And the health physics aspect of this operation, or any operation, whether it was Unit 3 or here, was really a quality operation on their part. Now, everybody that worked around radioactivity, every Monday had to give a urine sample in I think it was a half-pint ice cream container. And then that was taken to the cold lab, which was another lab I haven't mentioned yet, on West 1st Street, which is where they did the urine analysis on West 1st Street. Now, there's what I think is the funniest story before I got here. If your count, the urine count was too high, then what they did is they gave you a glass gallon jug. And that was your toilet until it got filled. And then you brought that back the next morning or 2 days or whatever. Usually it was done over the weekends. And you brought that back to the Unit 4 or Unit 3 health physics office. And then they would take that over to the, what we call the P lab, pardon me, on West 1st Street. And they'd analyze it to see how bad off you were, or how maybe not so bad off you were. And then that decided whether you were going to stay in a hot area until your count got down low enough or you could go back in. In the meantime, what you did is you worked in a cold area. The cold area, Unit 4, was, quote, a lounge, where you read, wrote reports, or played cards. So before that, they had, as I said, glass gallon jugs that they gave you to take home. Well, one day, on the way in, full jug. Of course, in those days, we didn't have cars in those days like you do today. You know, nowadays, every family's got 2 and 3 cars. In those days, you were lucky to have one car. Most of us rode the bus. Thank God the transportation system back in those days was pretty good. Well, one day, one of the fellows who filled up his jug was on his way back to Unit 4, and he's walking down the aisle on the bus to get off. The glass hits the metal part of the handle. The next day, everything that was glass was removed, and we went to polyethylene gallon jugs. There was some humor at times, you know, working at this place. Anyway, the health physics people not only did that, but the reason I needed Warren here, I've seen 2 references in the reports that the air, the water, groundwater, and the soil was sampled and counted to make sure that it was not contaminated through an area, or a radius rather, of 25 miles. I've also seen it written someplace where that radius was 75, and I never did know it. Do you know which?
No, I don't know.
So that's why we need Warren here. But in either case, Monsanto, well, the government, the health physics people made sure that you had a lot to worry, that you complied with all the rules and regulations. And everybody tried to do it, by the way. Now, one of the things that happened when you're working, like Herb there's got his hands in these gauntlets, usually 2 of these glove box lines were built parallel to each other, and there was a corridor in between them which was really contaminated, because if you needed to maintain the equipment within the glove box, that's the only way you could do it. You could put on a set of coveralls, maybe 2, or maybe sometimes one set of coveralls and a smock, and shoe covers, and a respirator. I mean, it was something else. But then you got contaminated. Your hands, you'd go in, you showered after that, because none of your personal clothing was worn when you were back in what we call the hot corridor. And so when you finished up, you showered, and even if you didn't go back and do that, like Herb is doing there, he's got his hands, it's in a hot area. Before going to lunch or whatever, leaving the plant site or the lab site, you had to scrub your hands, and lava soap was the first thing you used. And you scrubbed, and then you dry them, and you put them under an alpha counter, and if you were above, well, if the needle moved on you, you weren't good enough. So you went back and you scrubbed some more, and after the second time, if that didn't work, then you went back and they had a bottle of Clorox there. And so you used Clorox and the brush. Usually by then, your hands were starting, your knuckles were starting to bleed. It didn't make any difference. You still had to get rid of all that. Now, if that didn't work, then they used 3-normal hydrochloric acid as the last resort.
Oh, wow.
Some of you guys know what I'm talking about. Not a pleasant operation, but anyway, it was to your own advantage, really, to make sure your hands were not contaminated, especially if you're going to go home and you have a family.
Last name Hanson.
Pardon?
Hanson.
That individual is a retired Navy guy, Herb Hanson, a very, very pleasant gentleman from south of Dayton. I'm not sure what community he lived in, but he was a nice guy. He's in there. But I think that was the second line that we built. Now all the process equipment that's within the glove boxes was put together. We used a lot of glass tubing. Instead of pouring from one beaker to another, we transferred everything from one flask to another by vacuum and all that, and that was all done within the confines of the glove box. We've already talked about that. Oh, yeah. Well, do we have a shot of the lower lot? Yeah. Now, one of the things that Montana had to worry about was being a good citizen, community citizen. And of course, every time we had a complaint, they tried to do something, get back, communicate with whoever made the complaint. And as I said, people of Oakwood were most upset. Now, we did not, by the way, come in with a big delivery truck like a semi and unload merchandise. That usually happened with the biggest truck we ever used for that was a 1.5-ton stake truck, or a smaller vehicle if possible. The slugs that were brought in from Hanford were flown in a right pat. They were brought in here. They were delivered in the middle of the night. I never did know what kind of truck was used. Never asked, and it was none of my business anyway. Because yeah, you had a clearance, but there were a lot of things that went on that you weren't privy to know about. You never even asked. You just didn't think about it. All right, so this is the lower lot. Now, moving forward, we're going to get to Unit 5 one of these days. I hope you don't have an urgent need to go to a meeting or something. But anyway, so we're in the process of decontaminating Unit 4, getting it all cleaned up. I had a crew of 27 men, and we were cleaning it up and removing equipment that was contaminated, and it was either painted or either drummed or put in boxes or something. And one day, I get a call from Joe Burbage, was the plant manager at that time. They said, "We've got a complaint." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "The lady in Oakwood just said that we have radioactivity, little black pieces of radioactivity all over the ground in the lower lot. I said, well, let me go check. So I go out and I look, and what we have back there by the fence is 2 mulberry trees. And of course, there's mulberries all over the ground.
Yeah.
So I go back and I call him up and I said, well, there's nothing up there but mulberries. He says, well, do something. I started to say, well, what do you want me to do? And then I decided I wasn't going to argue with the boss. So at that point in time, I thought a little bit. I went down and I got, this is not an actual shot of the people themselves, but this is what we did. So I got all the 3 guys, we dressed up like that. By the way, that's the mound in the background if you haven't noticed. So we had 3 of them that had brooms, and we went around and swept the entire cobblestone area of the lower lot. One guy had the shovel, and they shoveled mulberries in there, and we shoveled it into a drum, and we cleaned that lower lot up. I mean, it was clean. So by the time we finished, which was about 2.5, 3 hours later, Joe Burbage calls me up again. He said, what did you do? And so I told him. Well, he thought that was pretty funny. I don't think it was funny what he did. Well, we got to interrupt work that these 3 guys were doing. So he said, this lady called up and she's absolutely delirious as to our response. We got rid of all the radioactivity and that was it. But unfortunately, we didn't take pictures. We didn't take very many pictures back in the old days. This is where security was pretty tight. And during the cleanup operation, of course, we didn't take any pictures at all. Not even the guys that did that work. But anyway, good time was had by all. Try one more. Oh yeah, human interest story. Going back to 1946, housing in Dayton was not only tight, it was impossible. No matter what you wanted to do, you could not find a place, if you had a family especially. Guys like me went to the YMCA, which was a very nice place to stay at, by the way, in the old days. And so there were 3 families at Unit 4 who needed a place to stay, and somehow or other they found out about a place in Oakwood that was about 4 or 5 blocks from Runnymede. That was for rent, and the rent at that time was all of $600 a month. That was the house. It was empty, and so these 3 families rented the place. One next slide, please. That's the best shot we have of the living room, which is 18 by 36. That's just the living room alone. The dining room was 18 by 18, which you don't see. The sun porch was 18 by 18, and I mean, you know, what a place to have a party, I'll tell you. But anyway, they thought they were pretty lucky when they had to be able to rent it for $600 a month. And that attitude lasted until about the first DP&L bill in December. The first bill was $600. Now, what you don't know, and I'm going to tell you in a minute, their average salary of the 3 guys was about $300 a month. Wow. So 3 times 300 was 900. With the $600 for rent and $600 for DP&L, we got a problem, guys. So anyway, so the next time I went there, before I got there, they said, you better wear a heavy sweater, because the thermostat's down to 68 degrees. But anyway, that's the human interest story. But that was quite a place to go visit. It was pretty nice. Okay. Now eventually, a permanent site was needed by the Manhattan Project people. Now the work that we did at Unit 4 was, I call it quality work. We met our requirements process-wise of the amount of polonium needed, which we used to ship to Los Alamos. I'll take that back. A courier came to Unit 4, picked up the polonium, which was plated out on platinum gauze. The gauze was about 1/4 inch by about 1.25 inches, encapsulated, and the courier picked it up. And how he got to Los Alamos, I have no idea. I don't know whether he drove or flew or the military took him there, but that's another thing. You didn't know what was going on, you never asked, it was none of your business. So anyway, but a lot of part of 1946 it was decided that we needed a permanent installation for polonium. We just couldn't stay at Unit 4 forever. And so the contract was let out to a company out of Detroit, Kiffles, excuse me, in Valet. Big outfit. They only had about 700 engineers and designers in Detroit. That didn't include what they had across the river in Canada. And this was, they looked around and they found this real estate here. And initially it was 100 and I forget how many acres now at the moment, but anyway.
170.
170. Eventually, the plant site, by the way, grew to 328 acres. And so what you're looking at here these are 2 stacks, there's 1, there are 2. Now if you read the literature, it says they're 300 feet high. That's not right. They're 200 feet.
200 feet.
And everything that you see there, over and through here, and underneath it, these towers are the towers, and we'll show you a cross-section in a minute, that go down into the T-building itself. Now the T-building was unique in the sense that it was, each floor was about the size of a football field, slightly larger, but not much. And the process area was totally contained in the T-building. All polonium that was produced after we shut Unit 4 down. But we didn't shut Unit 4 down until we had this going and we were making polonium and initiators here. Now, that's the administration building, which is no longer, if you go out and look around, that's gone. We had a number of buildings that were devoted to, well, for example, we had a B building which for biological research. We had a group of biological researchers, group leaders, and the head of the department of that group, all PhDs in their field. We did not know how polonium affected the body or the various organs. That had to be decided. So that was there. So everything that was needed was put on the hill originally. Did we get a shot of the mound when we closed it, shut it down?
Do you want that one?
No, we didn't show that one. Okay. We needed to build a T building, which I started to tell you about. And it was built into the side of a hill across from the golf course. And the golf course, of course, has on it a mound, the Indian mound, the only one of its size in the United States. And so the T building was built on the side of the hill because the military wanted a place that we could produce polonium that would be capable of producing polonium no matter what. So you designed the T building, that I said was, each floor was 2 floors, each size, again, was the size of a football field. The roof was 15 feet thick, 40% reinforced steel. The side walls were 17-foot nominal, actual 16 foot 9 inches. And that was all built into the side of the hill. Now 15-foot reinforced concrete is a lot of concrete and a lot of steel. Now, unfortunately, we only have a sample back in one of the rooms back here, the end one, or almost the end one. Reinforcing rod that we have here was like that, about 1 inch. The major pieces of reinforcing were elliptical, about 4 foot from, scrub that, 4 inches long and about 2.5 inches across. We had a sample of that, but somebody wanted it worse than we did, so we don't have it anymore. But that's that's how that hillside looked. Actually, it was a combination of 3 farms when the government bought it. And we had our own, I say we, I mean the contractor, Maxim Construction, had a cement plant that ran 24 hours a day. When they started pouring concrete, they didn't quit until they were finished. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't just unique. It was the only building of its kind in the world, and it would withstand a 2,000-pound penetrating bomb, not a 2,000-pound bomb, but one that was penetrating before it exploded. But everything that was needed to produce polonium could be done in that building for 30 days, totally isolated from the world. And that was another experience that I had. Since I was part of the operating crew back in those days, one weekend we were told ahead of time to bring our pajamas and toothbrush and all that. And we spent a night in the T building, all locked out, no communications, nothing. We had K rations and I forget what all else. But anyway, it was quite an experience. Now, at the same time, back in late 46, early 47, the military said, gee, that's the only place we've got that's going to produce polonium. We don't have enough production capacity to meet what we think we're going to be needing in the future. So we then decided, meaning the military decided, we needed to build another production plant, if you will. And that was the plant at Marion. That was Unit 6. Marion, if you don't know, is about 100 miles north and slightly east of here. The ground that the plant was put on had been an ordnance works during World War II. The government owned the property already. The support buildings like warehousing and that type of thing was already there. So all they had to do was put up another building. It was sole function to do the same thing and only thing that the T building did. We never opened the plant. We finished it. We completed the building, but we never staffed it. And in time, the people that were there that were available to be transferred here were transferred back here. For some of you that may have known him, Alan Morton was one, Ernie Hart was another, and I don't remember anybody else at the moment.
Jack Putnam. Jack Putnam.
Jack Putnam, for those of you that might know him. That's a shot of Scioto Labs in Marion. So all the support buildings, warehousing, and all that kind of thing, it was that's it. The only new construction really that was needed was the operations building. Last slide. That's a shot of construction to give you an idea of how much steel was in that building. As I said, that went on 24 hours a day. Now that's a cross-section of the T building. And you can see that the ceiling, pardon me, the roof, we'll get there eventually, that's 15 feet thick. Second floor is the operations floor, which I think we've already shown you. The first floor was mechanical equipment. Everything had to be double and triple shouldered, nothing out of a hot area to be contaminated and discharged to the atmosphere, one of which went up to one of the 200-foot stacks I talked about earlier. Now, you had access, you could see the guard shoulder. What I used to hate, as did everybody else, is once a year we had a drill, fire drill, And we had everybody on the lab, everybody on the hill had to go to the second floor. But you couldn't take the elevator. Well, going down, it wasn't bad. But when they finally said it's all clear, then you had to walk up 5 flights. A lot of them were down there on the first floor too, by the way. That's a long haul. That's 5 stories. Today, I don't think I can do it. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but a lot of you couldn't do it today either. Now, let's go back to that. Now, what happened eventually, and this happened, I think, in the 60s or 70s, I don't remember. But for those of you that worked on in the detonator area or the explosives area, we needed another building called the DS building. I was the project engineer on that, and don't ask me what DS stood for, I have no idea.
Dimensional standards.
What?
Dimensions and standards.
Somebody else gave it that name, I had nothing to do with that. So anyway, the DS building was built right on top of here. We didn't worry about the 15 feet collapsing because it had too much load on it. And that's gone also. Now, for those of you who have been here before, or those when you leave tonight, you'll see some buildings that are up. Any of those buildings can be demolished. Well, in fact, a lot of them were demolished. But one thing you've got to realize is that the T building, Dick and I have discussed this, by the way. There's no way they're going to demolish the T building. We got a shot of that now? The entryway. Oh, I forgot I had that. That's the layout of the operations floor. Again now, this is all devoted to polonium. And it's either that, I think that wall and that wall were 3 feet thick, reinforced to help support all the load that was necessary to carry on it. The P&E lines that you saw with the elephants on it, if you will, that was there. Bismuth decay. Well, eventually they were able to remove the aluminum can as opposed to doing it chemically they were able to do it, worked out a process to do it mechanically. And someplace on here, I don't see it at the moment, but it's on here. I think it's down the line in this neighborhood here is, I've lost it, but anyway, do we have a swimming pool shot there?
That's a day one layout there, George. There's a lot of stuff that was put in shortly after this. Doesn't show.
There it is. Backing up a little bit, when the slugs came in, and what we call the egg crates, they were brought to this was at the west end of the T building off the dock, and they were stored underwater, and they were stored as individual, what we call egg crates. It was limited by who could go there and look around and see what was going on because it was none of your business. Okay. Did I wrap it up?
Next one.
That's the P&E line and the T building. See how nice and clean that looks? And by the way, it did look like that. Now, it wasn't just new construction. But these are, well, incidentally, these are all made out of plywood. Subsequently to turning down Mound Lab, or even before that, all glove boxes were stainless steel, pressure tested, made sure that nothing leaked. Because again, we're worried about the personnel and making sure you stay healthy. What's the next one, Dave? This is our last slide, and that's the west entrance to the T building. Now, the only reason that Dick and I discussed putting this one in is that any building on the hill can be torn down. By the way, incidentally, by '86, Mound Lab had about 320 some acres and 1 million square feet of laboratory or building space. Now, that's the west exit of the tunnel. Obviously, when you've only got one lane, you're going to come in the east end and out the west end. And we look upon that as being the monument to all the workers that worked at Mound and the work that they did. We don't need to identify the tunnel exit with a lot of, tell you what it is, we already know what it is, and we don't think that'll ever be torn down. I don't know how you're going to tear down 40% reinforced concrete. Other than that, that's about it.
Any questions for George?
I have one. Where was the bismuth and polonium? Where did they come from? Canada?
Well, originally the ore came from Canada and Ontario. It was a radium processing plant that the Canadians had. That was the one load of 700 and some tons.
Fort Hope, Canada. Or lead.
Wherever that.
Bismuth went to Hanford after it was put in aluminum. And it was irradiated in a reactor at Hanford and then shipped by rail to Dayton.
Did you say Fort Hope or Port Hope?
Port. P-O-R-T as far as I know.
Yeah.
No, it's P-O-R-T.
It's right along the lake, east of Toronto.
Right there in the back.
George, do you know which isotope of the polonium was?
210.
Can't hear.
You wanted to know which isotope of polonium it was.
210.
210.
It was 210.
Don?
The story of cobalt is going to go on. I mentioned this to
Yeah, excuse me, Don's our resident expert on spies.
the story of cobalt is bound to go on.
I got it.
I got a call about a month ago from Jim DeBras, who used to be one of the best reporters in the Dayton Daily News. He took early retirement and they reshuffled the Daily News, and he's working on a PhD at English, I believe, at Ohio University. And he had gotten a call from a Russian director who's doing a film on the life of cobalt. And this director and his cameraman wanted to take some pictures of where cobalt lived downtown in Dayton, and they wanted to talk to me and DeBras. So we tried to make an appointment. I went down there with my son and we sat around, and they were late. And so we finally gave up after an hour and a half, but they came out to the nursing home where my son is and talked to me there. And there was the director, producer, and his cameraman, and there was a professor from Vanderbilt who was taking a summer job as an interpreter for these people as they went around the country. This is the 100th anniversary of the birth of cobalt, and so they hope to have this finished as a documentary sometime late in the summer. And I have some emails and so forth, so I still have some contact with them, particularly this interpreter from Vanderbilt. So we look forward to that.
What about the 3,000-page FBI file that DeGrosse was going to get?
They have it at the Dayton Daily News, and he hasn't seen it himself. It arrived after he left, and he's been told by people who've looked at it there's not much information. That's hard to believe. But so he promised to try to get a copy for us. And I said, well, can't we just get it on a CD as electronic version? And he's looking into that supposedly for us. And he also proposed the thing that I've wanted a long time, is to write a detailed, more complete history of the Dayton Project and polonium. I told him I had at least 200 pages of notes on various aspects of this. So he says, why don't we do this together? So it's floating out there. I don't know whether we'll get it done. I may not live long enough to get it done, but if so, I'll give him the notes too.
Sorry.
Incidentally, two things, one of which I forgot to tell you, is that
That was one of the things they asked.
Don is our resident expert on a whole lot of other things besides
I don't know.
cobalt.
I couldn't answer that.
Now, one thing that Dick Matting made up for you, and there's 2 pages.
He's gonna talk about it.
Oh, well, let me talk about this other thing. We wonder about the Japanese role in the atomic energy program. Believe it or not, we in the United States did not think they had either enough resources, they didn't have enough knowledge to develop an atomic weapon. Japan started working on an atomic program sponsored by the Army in 1931. 2 years later, the Navy sponsored an atomic weapons program, and they did this in Korea. The Army worked in Tokyo, the Navy worked in Korea. Between August 6th and August 9th, so we understand, they actually detonated an experimental atomic weapon in Korea, which we did not know about. And we didn't think they had enough capacity or enough resources. Now, you've probably heard about the submarine that we captured at the end of World War II that had uranium on it. Fortunately, even if all that uranium had gotten to Japan, they were going to wipe us out, by the way. They built a submarine, an airplane that was dismantled and loaded aboard, capable of being loaded onto the submarine. And there were 3 potential targets for Japan. One was the Panama Canal, the second site was Los Angeles, the prime site was San Francisco. At that time, San Francisco was about 400,000 people. So if you think we made a mistake, you better think about my last statement. That's it.
Thanks, George.